Velkommen til din første leksjon. Welcome to your first lesson. We're going to start out by learning the alphabet, as it's pretty important to know how these letters sound when used in words. The entire alphabet in Norwegian is A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, B, W, X, Y, Z, Æ, Ø, Å. So, as you can see, it consists of the normal English alphabet in addition to these 3 extra funky letters. But don't worry, they're not too funky, and we'll get around to looking at them in detail soon enough. We're going to go through each individual letter now. I'll give you examples of how they sound when used in words, and we will also take a look at their different variations in pronunciation. Before we begin, I want to note that most of the vowels have 2 different pronunciations, either long or short. Long vowels are usually followed by single consonant, while short vowels tend to be followed by double consonants. In other words, you can often tell what the word sounds like by noticing if it has a singular or double consonant. As we go through the alphabet, I will give examples of these 2 different variations of pronunciations. Over time, this will totally be second nature, and you don't have to think of this consciously at all. But for now, you can use this little rule to help you figure out how certain words are pronounced. A, alphabet, alphabet. An example of a long and short A is fra, frakk, fra, frakk. B, banan, banan. C. When it comes to the letter C, there are a few different pronunciations. Typically, however, it will either sound like an S or a K sound. So examples would be camping, camping. Celle, celle. Kristoffer, Kristoffer. Chili, chili. D, dør, dør. Occasionally, a D inside a word may be silent, and a few examples of this are brød, brød. Sand, sand. Eple, eple. An example of the long versus short E is se, engelsk, se, engelsk. Occasionally, the E will also sound like the letter A. An example is er, which means is. Very, very seldom you will also see an E with a little accent on the top. And basically what that means is that you add emphasis on the E sound. Idé. I also want to mention that when it comes to writing Norwegian, the little accent on the top of the E in these particular instances is actually optional. It's not something that you have to do. So luckily for you, you don't really have to worry about this letter. F. Fabrikk, fabrikk. G. Gutt, gutt. Sometimes when the G is the first letter of a word, it will sound like the Norwegian J. So an example of that is geit, geit. The G can also be silent. This is when it's at the end of a word following an I, or when it's in front of a J. Heldig, heldig. Igjen, H, hode, hode. The H can also be silent. This is typically when the H is followed by a J or a V, and these usually occur in the beginning of a word. Examples of this are hjelm, va, i, idrett, idrett. An example of the long and short pronunciation of I is sier, ikke, sier, ikke, yeah, jod. So this letter can actually be said in two different ways when you say the actual letter itself. It's either yeah or yod. It doesn't matter which one you use, everyone understands both, and yeah is more common than yod. When pronounced, this letter sounds like the English Y. Jente, jente, K, K, konge, konge. The K can also have a sh sound, and that is usually when it's in front of an I or a J. Examples of this are kino, kino, kjole, kjole, L, laks, laks, M, mage, mage, N, Norge, Norge, O, olje, olje. Sometimes the letter O can sound like the letter Å, and an example of this is norsk, norsk, P, penger, penger, Q. So Q is a letter that you literally never see this in Norwegian. So to be honest, you don't have to worry about Q whatsoever. But if it is used, it sounds just like in English. So an example is quiz, R, radio. The R sound might be one of the more difficult sounds in Norwegian. You might notice that there's this very slight E sound in front of the R. So it doesn't just start an R, like in English it would be radio. In Norwegian it's radio. I think this comes from the fact that the Norwegian R can be said continuously, like this. R. And the E sound that you hear initially is from starting this continuous R sound. S, sofa. When S is written in combination with a K, with a KJ, or a J, it will sound like a sh sound. This sound also occurs when the S follows an R. Examples of this would be skilt, skjold, dusj, person, te. This word actually sounds just like the letter itself, which is very similar to English, I guess, because if you say T, it means both T and the letter T. So yeah, this is just te. When you see the letters ET in Norwegian, the T may be silent. And some examples of that are huset, det, uke. An example of a long versus a short U is bruke, huske. Sometimes the letter U will sound like O. Examples of this are ungdom, bukse. Note that a single U in front of a word acts the same way as un is used in English. In other words, meaning the opposite of whatever follows that letter. An example of this is ukjent. Ved. Vann. W. Wienerpølse. Extremely few Norwegian words use W. It's very, very uncommon, just like the Q, and it actually sounds exactly the same as V. In fact, people even say WC instead of WC. X. Again, this is a letter that is never used in Norwegian. It's used so little that I don't even have an example for you, other than a name, which is Alex. Alex. E. E. The letters E and E can sound very similar in Norwegian. To make the E sound, purse your lips. To make the E sound, widen your mouth. Notice the difference between Y and E. Syk. 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 Notice that the letter I in Norwegian sounds exactly like E in English. By the way, syk with an I is not a real Norwegian word. I'm only using it here to contrast between the Y and I sound. Irke. Irke. An example of a short versus long E is lyst, lyst. Lyst, lyst. Zett, zett. Again, this is a letter that you never see in Norwegian, but it sounds exactly like in English whenever you see it. Zambia, Zambia. And now we've reached the 3 extra letters that the Norwegian alphabet has. The first one is A, and as you can see, it is composed of an A and an E put together. A, A. Bær, bær. Trær, trær. It sounds just like the American bad or apple. Øl, øl, øl. So, as you can tell, the double consonant rule does not apply to this word. I'm not sure why, but it just doesn't. It actually sounds like it's supposed to have 2 L's. But an example of a long versus a short is kjøre, trøtt, kjøre, trøtt, å, åtte, åtte. An example of a long versus short å is stå, åtte, stå, åtte. This letter sounds identical to the Norwegian word å, which means and. Å by itself means to, as in to fish or any other verb. It's what you use in front of verbs in their infinite form. An extra thing to note about the 3 last letters here is that even if you aren't able to type these on your keyboard, you can still write these, and you do that by writing AE for A, OE for Ö, and 2 A's for Å. And if you write this, every Norwegian will understand what you mean. In fact, it was exactly 100 years ago in 1917 that double A's were replaced with Å. So if you ever read old Norwegian texts, you'll see double A instead of Å. And there are actually still people who have names that use a double A instead of the more modern Å. So, to repeat the Norwegian alphabet one more time, we have A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, Z, Æ, Ø, Å. Try practicing saying it yourself a few times. Use the left arrow on the keyboard to go back a few seconds and hear it again. So, there we have it, the Norwegian alphabet. Remember, these letters Q, W, X, and Z are virtually never used in the Norwegian language. Luckily for you, that makes Norwegian a bit easier to learn. I know this video contained a lot of information and it's a lot to take in a single sitting, but it's essential that you start out learning the language with a foundational understanding of the pronunciation. And as you watch more lessons, you will now know that you can always come back to this video to refresh your memory on how to properly pronounce Norwegian. Note that there are some quirky words out there that won't really follow these guidelines, and as with any language, you're just gonna have to learn those as you come across them. Another tip I have for you is If you're serious about learning Norwegian and want to speak it well, spend your initial learning period really focusing on how the language sounds. Repeat the words you hear out loud, do it multiple times, and really do your best to recreate the Norwegian sounds. This is really the only way you will be able to speak the language fluently and clearly. After a while, the correct pronunciation will be second nature, and you can focus more on things such as grammar. By the way, Norwegian grammar is super easy, but we'll get to that in a different video. Oh, what's this? It's a bonus word. And the word is gift. Gift. This is an example of the G sounding like a Norwegian J as the first letter of the word. Interestingly, this word has two meanings in Norwegian. It can mean married, or it can mean poison. A coincidence? Who knows? That concludes this video. I hope you enjoyed it. In the next video, you will learn how to greet people, how to ask them how they are doing, how to say your name, how to say goodbye, and it will be a much shorter video than this one, so it's definitely worth your time.